History as it happens, August 19th, 2021. Embracing defeat.
Thanks to our military and our allies and the brave fighters of Afghanistan, the Taliban regime is coming to an end.
The goal that I set to defeat al-Qaeda and deny it a chance to rebuild is now within our reach.
I'll be meeting personally with Taliban leaders in the not-too-distant future.
Our only vital national interest in Afghanistan remains today what it has always been: preventing a terrorist attack on America's homeland.
The U.S. war in Afghanistan ended as it began, with the Taliban in power. Like the Soviet Union as it pulled out of Afghanistan more than 30 years ago, America is leaving the country broken by war, its military beaten by lightly armed jihadists, its people desperate for peace. If defeat was not inevitable, it is an opportunity to reassess U.S. interventionism and the unsustainable costs of forever war. That's next, as we report history as it happens, a podcast from the Washington Times. I'm Martin DeCaro.
We did not ask for this mission, but we will fulfill it.
By the end of 2014, the Afghans will be fully responsible for the security of their country.
Very much hoping that they will be doing what they say they're going to be doing. They will be killing terrorists.
Today, the terrorist threat has metastasized well beyond Afghanistan.
And that is why the U.S. is conducting counterterrorism operations in something like 85 countries. But before we deal with the present, let's go back to 1989.
Good evening. The retreat of Soviet military power from Afghanistan is complete. The last of Russia's regular army.
Superpowers aren't supposed to lose. But today, the Soviet Union concluded its retreat from Afghanistan.
Mikhail Gorbachev understood that as the Red Army destroyed Afghanistan, the war was destroying the USSR. The Soviet state simply could not afford to sustain the effort to save the communist regime in Kabul. It fell in 1992, and a group of young Islamic fanatics known as the Taliban took power 4 years later. But in 1989, there was hope for Afghanistan's future. Really? Here's President Bush speaking to reporters about the news of the Soviet withdrawal.
I feel strongly that time for recrimination is over, time for bloodbaths is over, and I would like to see the various factions get together and come up with recommendations that would lead to a peaceful Afghanistan with no more bloodbaths.
What would he have said if someone could have told him, Mr. President, 33 years from now, American soldiers will be leaving Afghanistan in defeat too? As for Gorbachev, he's 90 now. He told Russia's RIA news agency that the U.S. campaign in Afghanistan was doomed from the outset. Like many other similar projects, at its heart lay the exaggeration of a threat and poorly defined geopolitical ideas, said the last Soviet premier. To that were added unrealistic attempts to democratize a society made up of many tribes. Well, it's pretty clear many influential Americans, politicians, members of the foreign policy establishment and D.C. think tanks, talking heads on TV, do not agree with Gorbachev. In their view, President Biden lost Afghanistan, and now that country will become a base for al-Qaeda again.
Well, the argument makes sense if you put your blinders up and you look at the world in a vacuum.
Adam Weinstein of the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft is back with us today. He joined us in March for a discussion about whether the U.S. would comply with its part of the deal with the Taliban and leave the country this year. Well, now that we are on our way out, leaving behind scenes of chaos, desperation, and suffering, the second-guessing and partisan recriminations are everywhere. But the fact is, the situation in Afghanistan has been dire for quite a while. We simply weren't paying attention. For instance, the UN reported that more women and children were killed and wounded in the first half of 2021 than in the first 6 months of any year since the United Nations began systematically keeping count in 2009. Millions of ordinary people have been displaced, and many will never return home. The Afghan security forces, as well as the population, have suffered appalling casualties in combat with the Taliban and from U.S. and NATO airstrikes. So instead of asking how this intervention could have succeeded or might still succeed, the right question may be, what made us think invading Afghanistan would ever work? Especially when you consider the U.S. should know what it's dealing with here. It witnessed the Soviet disaster in the 1980s as the CIA channeled money and weapons to the jihadists who fought the Red Army. There's a good reason Afghanistan earned the sobriquet the graveyard of empires. That history was ignored in 2001, when the U.S. invaded Afghanistan to avenge 9/11.
The battle is now joined on many fronts. We will not waver. We will not tire. We will not falter, and we will not fail.
4 presidents later,
our mission in Afghanistan was never supposed to have been nation building. It was never supposed to be creating a unified, centralized democracy. Our only vital national interest in Afghanistan remains today what it has always been: preventing a terrorist attack on America's homeland.
Adam Weinstein's a research fellow at the Quincy Institute, focusing on security, trade, and rule of law in Afghanistan and Pakistan. He served as a U.S. Marine in Afghanistan in 2012 and has traveled extensively in that region. Adam, welcome back.
Thank you for having me.
So, Adam, let's begin with your thoughts on whether anyone should be surprised by what's happening right now. News reports say the White House and U.S. intelligence agencies did not expect Kabul to fall this quickly. But when we consider Afghanistan's history since 1979, the year of the Soviet invasion, as well as recent developments, was this outcome really unexpected?
I don't think the outcome was unexpected. People can point out decision points throughout the last 20 years that had a different decision been made, the outcome perhaps would have been different. But the thing is that inaccurate decisions is a risk that should be expected with any kind of intervention or nation building exercise. So when you have folks who say, well, it could have worked if only this set of perfect decisions had occurred, that's not a very realistic way of approaching this kind of massive undertaking. If you look at the general trajectory of the U.S. intervention in Afghanistan and the underlying power dynamics that existed in the country and in the region, it is not surprising that we have reached this point. The only thing that I think is surprising is how fast it happened at the end.
Yeah, apparently the Pentagon, right up until the end, was trying to convince President Biden to keep some forces in the country. But the Pentagon at that time was expecting that eventually this could happen, but just not quite so quickly. Is that your understanding of what's been going on too?
If you look at all the reports put out by SIGAR and by the Department of Defense and even by the Congressional Research Service and by academics and experts, if you look at all of these reports added up together, it points to a mission that's deteriorating. I mean, for years, the Taliban had been slowly gaining territory. It was sometimes described as a stalemate, but the Taliban were slowly winning. The Afghan government, by all accounts, suffered a legitimacy crisis. It wasn't so much that people supported the Taliban, just that they didn't really support the government, and they certainly didn't support them enough to fight and die for them. And then even if they did, the Afghan security forces weren't given the correct tools to fight, even if there was an esprit de corps and a resolve to fight. So I think everybody expected once the United States military took its fingers off the scales, things would deteriorate. I think people were surprised, including myself, by the rapid speed of this deterioration. But that only highlights the fact that this really was a paper tiger of a government that we had created.
You mentioned an acronym there, SIGAR, for our listeners who aren't familiar with that. That stands for Special Inspector General for Afghanistan Reconstruction. I do want to return to some of the findings SIGAR has made about the state of the Afghan military in a moment. But for now, I want to ask you about the plight of ordinary Afghans trying to flee the country. The fact is, most Americans have paid very little attention to civilian casualties since 2001. According to the Quincy Institute of International and Public Affairs at Brown University, as of this April, more than 71,000 Afghan and Pakistani civilians are estimated to have died as a direct result of the war. The U.S. military in 2017 relaxed its rules of engagement for airstrikes, and that resulted in a massive increase in civilian casualties. The CIA armed and funded Afghan militia groups who have been implicated in grave human rights abuses and killings of civilians. What are your thoughts on this, that Americans are paying attention now, but the situation has been gruesome and deteriorating for a long time?
Well, it has been deteriorating for a long time. And look, there wasn't the same level of national attention on the war as there was perhaps in Vietnam because we don't have a draft. And so people didn't have the same skin in the game. And we also did see an unacceptable number of U.S. deaths and casualties, but not at the level that you saw in Vietnam. So I think when it hits the news cycle and dramatic events happen, people pay more attention. When you see two men falling from a C-17 over the airport in Kabul, that will grab people's attention. But the reality is that civilians were dying left and right throughout this war, and the American public and even journalists didn't really care that much. So I think that explains the attention. Heightened attention and heightened perhaps emotional distress over something that's unfolding is not a good way to inform policy, though, especially when it doesn't reflect the net effect of the U.S. intervention, which is that the net effect of the U.S. intervention has been quite dismal. The United States has been successful in improving health conditions, maternal health, women's rights for some women in Afghanistan, but that ignores the absolute catastrophic levels of civilian casualties that have occurred in Afghanistan, only to bring us back to the Taliban taking control over the country.
You mentioned the C-17. I think we've all seen that horrifying video by now of people clinging to an American transport plane, desperately trying to get out of the country. So much has been made about the collapse or disappearance of Afghanistan's army, especially in light of the $83 billion spent training and equipping it over the past 2 decades. I want to ask you about 2 possible explanations about why that happened in a moment. But first, on a deeper level, it seems to me anyway that one side in this war believes in the cause it's fighting for, is willing to die for it. That would be the Taliban. And one side does not, and that is the U.S.-equipped, U.S.-supported Afghan security forces. Am I wrong about that? Am I making this too simple?
Look, any statement about Afghanistan is going to be too simplistic unless it's a dissertation-length statement. But I do think there's a value in distilling things down to those simple statements sometimes. And folks in the Beltway and sometimes journalists and analysts will get very upset when a simple statement like that is made. But that is to some degree the reality of what happened. Look, Afghan security forces in many cases fought valiantly. They sustained incredibly high casualties. The problem was really in the Afghan government and the senior leadership of the Afghan security forces. And those folks ran the government to their personal benefit, almost like it was a personal corporation in some ways. And they did not provide the leadership that was necessary to convince the Afghan security forces to continue fighting indefinitely or for the amount of time that might have been necessary to perhaps have enough leverage over the Taliban to extract a meaningful settlement from them. Whereas the Taliban, who also, by the way, took incredibly high casualties and didn't have the benefit of air support or modern weapons, they fought with a great deal of zeal and resolve because I think they truly believed in what they were fighting for. I think there was, among some ranks of the Afghan security forces, the resolve eroded because they had been taking high casualties and they saw that their leadership in Kabul was not truly invested long term. And they didn't feel that the Afghan state that had been built after the U.S. invasion in 2001 was worth dying for. Now, I say that with the caveat that tens of thousands of them have died, but they didn't at this juncture have the resolve to continue fighting for a state that they didn't think, I suppose that they didn't think was sustainable.
Because this is the critical juncture, because now they're more or less on their own. And your colleague at the Quincy Institute, Anatol Lieven, who has been on this podcast, he wrote an essay in Politico about how entire units of the army and security forces negotiated in advance with the Taliban to stop fighting. What are your thoughts on that explanation?
Basically, the Taliban were very Machiavellian about things, and they were able to fight the more elite units while convincing the regular rank and file of Afghan security forces to surrender. And sometimes that happened by making deals with local power brokers, and sometimes that happened by dealing with Afghan security forces directly. And they used information warfare, so to speak, and propaganda. They would release these videos of them allowing ANDSF or Afghan security forces to surrender en masse. And, you'd see the Taliban and the soldiers kissing each other on the cheeks, and they'd be hugging the soldiers and welcoming them with open arms. So I think the Taliban very shrewdly identified who are the folks that we can't convince to surrender, or who we can't co-opt, and we'll still fight them, but everyone else will convince to surrender. This ultimately was a political victory, not a military victory. It was a political victory for the Taliban and a political loss for Kabul. This war ended politically, in a sense, more than it did militarily.
To your earlier point, it's not that there are no Afghan soldiers or security forces who are willing to fight and die for their country. An estimated 64,000 have died in this war since 2001. But similar to the situation the United States faced in South Vietnam a half-century ago, there simply aren't enough of those soldiers, and they have a leadership that's either hopelessly corrupt or inept. Shay Kateri, a graduate student at Johns Hopkins University, wrote a piece for The Bulwark saying the Afghan army is capable, but more than 17,000 military contractors stopped working with it. We think of the American soldiers that were in the country, about 3,500, but 17,000 military contractors were there. They're gone, and that deprived Afghans of indispensable logistical support. So those soldiers say it's fruitless to try to resist the Taliban. What do you think of that explanation?
I'm half persuaded by that argument. Look, I advocated for the withdrawal. I also advocated for the continuation of contractors who could maintain the aircraft, the airframes. As you pointed out, the casualties have been high. In 2020, the number I see is 10,900 Afghan security force fatalities. In 2019, another 10,900. And the numbers were a little bit lower during the surge era, when I think the Americans were doing much of the fighting and the ANDSF were more so at static outposts and or taking less intense patrols and missions. But I think that the lack of capacity due to the removal of the contractors would have had an effect over time. So if we had seen the Afghan state hold out militarily, let's say for the next few months, and then ultimately the Taliban defeated them, then I think maybe the explanation that it was the contractors would be more persuasive. But we do have to remember that even in the last several weeks, the United States was providing close air support. The Afghan Air Force, which was operating with a significant number of its airframes grounded, was still conducting airstrikes. So I don't think the removal of the contractors really explains this mass surrender. I think what explains it is that there was a lack of leadership at the top, and the Afghan security forces surrendered because they made a rational calculation that the Afghan state wasn't worth dying for. And basically what the Taliban did was they weaponized the prisoner's dilemma.
And there's another issue here, the issue of the ghost soldiers, Afghan troops who did not exist, their salaries pocketed by corrupt officials. So on paper, the Afghan army and the security forces had more than 300,000 men at their disposal, but the actual number of combat-ready troops is much smaller. When it comes to who makes up the Afghan army, it's primarily a Pashtun force, right?
I have to say that, and I know this is a faux pas to do in the policy space, I don't know the ethnography of the ANDSF very well, to the point that I could cite percentages. But I do think there was some diversity to it. I mean, there were sometimes complaints that ethnic Tajiks perhaps were patrolling in Pashtun areas, and it created some animosity. But that gets outside of my focus.
The reason why I ask is I wondered if the security forces could ever identify with a nation state propped up by the United States, or if their ethnic or tribal affiliations would matter more. 20 years sounds like it might be enough time to build a cohesive military that aligns with the state. But as we've been discussing, the evidence suggests otherwise. Many Afghan soldiers did not feel invested in the survival of the Kabul government, or that Ashraf Ghani was the president of an actual country.
Yeah, look, I addressed this in a briefing I wrote for the Quincy Institute, and I basically said that the ethnic nature of the conflict should not be exaggerated, but an analysis of civil wars with an ethnic component found that, quote, warfare heightens ethnicity as the relevant line of cleavage in society, and perceived grievances against a particular ethnic group will lead to a hardening of ethnicity as the primary source of identity. And what I'm reading from is actually from studies that have been conducted by political scientists who have studied civil wars in general. Now, some folks don't like when you classify Afghanistan as a civil war because they'll say the Taliban was a proxy of Pakistan. Well, we also have to remember that the Afghan security forces themselves were largely supported by the international community and in particular the United States. I think this was a civil war that had proxy elements. Certainly the Afghan Taliban have elements of a proxy agent relationship with Pakistan's security apparatus. But that doesn't change the fact that they are also part of Afghan society. A lot of civil wars or insurgencies or anti-state groups have had support from abroad. So I think the ethnic component in this conflict was not the primary driver. And there were inter-ethnic components too, where, remember, Ashraf Ghani is a Pashtun. Karzai is a Pashtun. There were inter-ethnic rivalries over who represented an ethnic group. So I think you could make the case that in Afghanistan, sometimes ethnic affiliation was elevated over national affiliation. Not the main driver of the conflict, but certainly just made it all that more intractable to solve, and is a case in point why folks at the Pentagon couldn't grasp the complexity. How could they possibly grasp the complexity of Afghanistan in a way that they could design a coherent plan? That's not what their role is. That's not what their expertise is. That's not what they're trained to do.
A good friend of mine who's a retired historian pointed out that the Taliban, who are, of course, Pashtuns, the Taliban look exactly like civilian Afghans. It's the Afghan soldiers who are decked out in uniforms that make them look like American clones, which, my friend says, we intended them to be. What factions are remaining in Afghanistan who might resist the Taliban? Some of the warlords from the 1980s and 90s are still around, aren't they?
Well, yes, and I would point out, although the Taliban is a majority Pashtun organization, it has brought in other ethnic groups in the north, for example. But I do think your friend is correct in terms of how the Taliban were able to use that as a propaganda tool, which is that, look, we're the real Afghans and the government and the soldiers are slaves of the Americans. That's the kind of language that the Taliban would use, and you can see how they could use that imagery to advance it. In terms of pockets of resistance, I mean, various militia commanders such as Dostum and Atanur. Ismail Khan was a militia commander in Herat who had initially put up a fight against the Taliban when they were trying to take the city, but ultimately was placed under house arrest by the Taliban. And then they released a statement that he had joined them, although I've also seen reports that he might have escaped to Iran. I don't know what his current status is. Atanur was fighting in the north last week and then fled and released a statement basically criticizing the Ghani administration and accusing them of trying to basically have them killed by almost setting a trap for them by the Taliban and trying to sabotage their mission. This is what Atanur claimed. And he also claimed the same thing had been done to Abdul Rashid Dostum, who was an ethnic Uzbek leader and was also fighting. So whether these former warlords coalesce again to create a resistance will be interesting. History suggests that they're going to try to do it. And the son of Ahmed Shah Massoud, who led the Northern Alliance and was killed just before 9/11 happened, his son is currently in the Panjshir Valley, possibly trying to organize a resistance. And of course, there's rumors that Amrullah Saleh, who's the former first vice president, and was in many ways Ashraf Ghani's right-hand man in these last few months. There's rumors that he's also in the Panjshir Valley. Amrullah Saleh actually tweeted today that he was going to start the resistance. That's the word he used, was the resistance. He said he was inside Afghanistan and he's going to lead the resistance. So how organized these groups are and whether they reconstitute themselves into a formidable opponent of the Taliban remains to be seen.
You mentioned Massoud, the Lion of Panjshir, killed by al-Qaeda, I believe, on September 10th, 2001. So it sounds like, based on your answer, that it's possible the fighting will continue. I wonder if the Taliban will have any more luck than Ashraf Ghani at controlling the country. Is the Taliban actually interested in running a central government?
Well, they're behaving right now as if they're interested in that. They have a governance capacity problem. When they had their emirate in the late 90s, their governance model was not very sophisticated, and Afghanistan was languishing as a result. Now they're dealing with a population that's connected to the internet, that's far more educated than it's ever been before. Social changes have occurred, even in the rural areas. So it's going to be a harder population to control using the brutal tactics that the Taliban have used in the past. And also, the cities have just become more developed with large buildings and much more infrastructure and larger populations to manage. And so whether the Taliban succeeds or not, I think is going to depend on whether they're able to co-opt all the public service workers and people with technical capacity, and whether those people will work with the Taliban in a way that is productive. So the Taliban have claimed that they want civil servants to return to work. We'll see whether that claim is genuine or not. If they engage in a campaign of intimidation and retributions, then I don't think it will work. Or if they're not willing to listen to folks who advise them, who were formerly part of the Afghan government, for example. I guess that will remain to be seen. Right now, what the Taliban seem to be pursuing is they've identified the people they don't think they can live with. And this is really morbid, but I think those people are going to disappear. And the rest of the Afghan population who they feel they can live with, including people who are members of the Afghan government or worked for the Afghan government in some way, they're going to try to co-opt them.
President Biden is being criticized by those who say Afghanistan will become a base for al-Qaeda again, and therefore the United States needs to remain in the country. How do you respond to that argument?
Well, the argument makes sense if you put your blinders up and you look at the world in a vacuum. It is true that we degraded, but we did not completely defeat al-Qaeda. That's always been true. It is true that the Taliban have maintained ideological and strategic links with al-Qaeda. That's also true. It's true that the withdrawal decision perhaps raises the likelihood of al-Qaeda being able to operate. I mean, not even perhaps, it definitely raises the likelihood of al-Qaeda being able to operate from Afghanistan and try to plan attacks in the region or perhaps on the homeland. The president's job, though, is to take all these different threats and prioritize them in a list. We are a country that just lost 600,000 people from a pandemic. We're a country that has all kinds of threats that it faces. And I think President Biden's calculation was the terrorism threat that is still posed does not justify permanent occupation of a country. That is a crazy precedent to set. The number of people in Washington, D.C. who believe that is a normal position or a reasonable position baffles me. And I think what stopped past presidents from making the hard decision that President Biden did is that in our hyper-partisan environment, the blowback of a terrorist attack happening post-withdrawal would be incredible. So I applaud President Biden for having the guts to take that risk. And I'll even applaud President Trump for having the guts to start that process.
It was the Trump administration that reached a deal with the Taliban in 2020 for the troop withdrawal. To your point about the threat of terrorism, for a long time after 9/11, it was difficult for any American politician to say, we're exaggerating this threat. And it seems that's what President Biden is saying right now. It's a problem to be managed, not something that can be eliminated.
Yeah, I think that's 100% true. And look, I'll never be someone to say that al-Qaeda has been defeated. I'll never be someone to say that the threat of transnational terrorist groups doesn't exist. It's simply that we need to decide who we are as a country. Are we a country that's going to hemorrhage money in American lives indefinitely because we're not mature enough as a society to deal with the risk of a hypothetical terrorist attack that might kill some Americans, but doesn't justify permanent occupation? Nobody approaches risk in their daily lives the way that the US government has approached risk in the war on terror. Because if we approached risk that way in our daily lives, we would stop driving cars. I mean, we would hire armed security guards for our homes if we could afford it, in the off chance that maybe somebody would break into it. And I suppose it would be offensive to some people in the Beltway for me to use these simple comparisons, but it really is that ridiculous when you step back and take a look at it.
I get your point. Is there any basis to expect the Taliban might cooperate or have some kind of working relationship with the United States? I mean, after all, negotiations between the two sides have been going on for years at Doha.
Well, look, I think we need to manage expectations. I think there should be some kind of relationship. It doesn't mean the United States has to endorse horrible things that the Taliban does. And it also doesn't mean that the Taliban have to adopt the policy prescriptions of the United States. But there needs to be some kind of communication. I think the United States needs to rethink the way it deals with troubled parts of the world and actors that it doesn't like. The choice cannot be between permanent military occupation or total disengagement. That's a crazy false choice. There is something in the middle. For the record, I think it's a mistake to completely end the U.S. diplomatic mission inside Afghanistan. I think our diplomacy needs to be less risk averse. In fact, I'd say our military interventions need to be more risk averse and our diplomacy abroad needs to be less risk averse. I understand that we want to protect our men and women who serve in the State Department, but I think it's a mistake to completely end the diplomatic mission.
Let me ask you, it appears the U.S. has virtually no soft power to exercise here after 20 years. Am I right about that?
I think you might be right at the moment, and I think it's pathetic that that's where we've come to. I think the United States still has power in terms of its ability to work with regional actors, such as Pakistan, China, Russia, and even Iran, if it chooses to exercise that. The problem with interventions is, look, we built a vibrant civil society in Afghanistan, or helped build it, because I think the civil society itself put in a lot of work. But now that civil society resents the United States because of the withdrawal. So what was our net soft power in that equation? Because let's not pretend for a moment that Washington was doing this out of its altruistic nature. That's not why Washington engages in soft power. Washington views soft power as an investment. And the problem with interventions is that it's almost like the moment you intervene in a conflict abroad, you have subjected yourself to a suspended prison sentence or a suspended sentence of some kind. And that's going to be the blowback that happens when you withdraw. And so all that goodwill you've built is erased overnight. Now, those who support permanent intervention will say, well, that's a reason to stay. But that's not sustainable either. It's a reason never to intervene in the first place and engage in a nation-building exercise that no U.S. government is willing to take on at the scale that would be required to even have 1/100th of a chance of succeeding.
I totally agree with you. To those who want to keep a U.S. military presence in Afghanistan, they are right insofar that it would prevent what we're seeing on our televisions today, the Taliban in Kabul. But to what end? How many years before the puppet government in Kabul of Ashraf Ghani or whoever would come after him? How many years until that government could stand on its own feet? I think our very presence there takes away the incentive for Afghanistan to become an independent nation. You follow what I'm saying?
No, I do. And look, a month ago, I might have pushed back on the idea that the Ghani administration was a puppet. I would have said, well, it has a lot of problems, but I don't know that it's fair to call it a puppet. But look at what happened. This needs to be a wake-up call for the United States. You know, even those of us who were most critical of the Ghani administration and most critical of the way the Afghan government was operating, it apparently enjoyed even less legitimacy than we thought. The leaders were less invested in their own country than we thought. And it was Afghans who paid the price. I always said, and I still believe this analysis is true, the majority of Afghans supported the idea of a republic over the idea of a Taliban emirate. The problem was the Afghan leaders and the U.S. policy towards those leaders and towards Afghanistan in general created a government that failed to meet the basic needs of the people in many cases. And so the country as a whole was not willing to fight for the survival of that state. It doesn't mean they didn't fight in the past. It doesn't mean they didn't sustain incredible losses. But as we saw over the last month, the country was not willing to fight to save that model of governance.
I think simply put, the lesson here is do not get involved to begin with. But in 2001, after what happened on 9/11, I don't think many people were thinking about the potential consequences of an invasion of Afghanistan. It just seemed like it was the right and just thing to do.
Look, I'm not going to sit here with 2020 vision and say that, oh, it was reasonable in that moment to do nothing. These decisions don't happen in a vacuum. I mean, I do not think the American people on September 12th would have accepted the president to say, well, look, we know who did it. Maybe we'll engage in some extremely limited strikes. I don't know that that would have been a very tenable position. But what they could have done is they could have gone after al-Qaeda in those first months of the war, and then they could have included the Taliban in this political negotiation process that ultimately happened at Bonn, and they could have left. And even after they made that mistake, there were points during the last 20 years when they could have negotiated with the Taliban. Of course, here's the trouble with running a counterinsurgency. The moment at which you have the most leverage over the insurgent group is also the moment when you can most convince yourself that you might defeat them militarily. But of course, we know that the insurgents just have to keep fighting, and the Taliban had a lot of will to do that. So there were points when we could have talked to the Taliban and really clamped down with the leverage we had to try to get a political settlement. We thought, almost like someone who sees a mirage in the distance, well, victory is right around the corner. But something that U.S. policymakers are going to have to ask themselves is, look at these casualties I cited earlier. I'm not even talking about civilian casualties. I'm talking about tens of thousands of Afghan soldiers who have died in the last few years. Could that have been prevented? I mean, look at what has happened in the last few weeks. We didn't see a protracted civil war. We didn't see the ANDSF putting up a resistance to the Taliban, but getting decimated by the Taliban. We didn't see any of that. We saw the war come to an end. We have to ask ourselves, if the end state was always going to be the Taliban taking over the country, was it really right for us to be creating the conditions by altering the power dynamics, by putting our thumb on the scale for this war to continue many more years than it had to? Well, the interventionists would say, yeah, but it didn't have to be that way. We could have won if we had just done A, B, C, and D. But again, the model of intervention that is sold in Washington, D.C. assumes that you can eliminate human error.
Well, Adam, maybe the most important issue of all here, as we discuss the U.S. defeat in Afghanistan, is whether it will make the United States finally understand that the projection of military power is an ineffective foreign policy tool. Why is it that the most lethal and sophisticated military in history counts for little when it comes to producing the desired outcome? Again, this is an issue that transcends the intervention in Afghanistan. It's about American foreign policy.
Well, for one, I think we need to be able to realize that a country or region can be important, even if it's not the most important. So what I hear a lot of people saying about Afghanistan will be, it's important because it's part of great power competition with China or Russia, which is ridiculous. Or they'll say it's not important because it's not part of great power competition, which I think is also ridiculous. Afghanistan is important. A more stable Afghanistan would benefit the United States. But no, the stability of Afghanistan or the choice of government in Afghanistan is not important enough to justify permanent U.S. military occupation. We have to be able to prioritize. Whether we've learned the lessons, I don't know. When I read the SIGAR reports, I applaud SIGAR for documenting year after year of failure. But then when you look at the conclusions of the report, sometimes they'll say, well, what we need to do is just accept the fact that we'll continue to engage in these interventionist policies. So we need to improve our capacity to engage in nation building activities. I think that's the wrong conclusion to draw. I think the conclusion to draw is that we'll never have the bandwidth to focus on nation building in the way that it would require to even have a chance of success. And I really question that it could ever have a chance of success, because the fundamental calculation of regional powers and political actors inside these countries will always be that, of course, the United States is going to leave one day. You see it in Iraq, you see it in Afghanistan. That's a rational calculation. There's plenty to criticize Pakistan about in terms of how it treated the war effort in Afghanistan or how it approached it. But at the end of the day, I think Pakistani leaders decided that one day the United States would leave and that it was too risky of a bet to assume otherwise. And I think certain political actors in Afghanistan assume this. The Taliban assume this. Other regional actors like Russia, China, and Iran assume this. And this is not to whitewash those regional actors. I think countries like Russia and China, Pakistan and Iran became incredibly comfortable with a small U.S. presence in Afghanistan that sort of kept things at a simmer while letting the Taliban sort of slowly make gains, so they didn't have to deal with it. Well, guess what? Now they have to deal with their neighbor. And I don't envy them.
Adam Weinstein of the Quincy Institute on a situation that seems to grow darker by the hour as the Taliban reasserts its grip on Afghanistan. You know, I've produced more episodes about Afghanistan than any other subject since we began this podcast in January, but I do not claim to truly understand that country. I think it would serve all of us to acknowledge the enormous complexities of Afghan society, history, culture, religion. But something does seem apparent to me. Any effort to create an Afghanistan in our own image, or to produce outcomes that suit us and not necessarily the people of that country, will fail. On the next episode of History as It Happens, the Arab Spring 10 years on. A decade ago, revolts erupted across the Middle East and North Africa, but democracy and economic justice were stillborn, even as dictators were toppled or killed. That's next, as we report History as It Happens, a podcast from the Washington Times.